They tore down his flag, crushed his garden, and laughed in his face. "What's an old man like you gonna do about it?" sneered Jake, the gang's cocky leader. But George Hudson wasn't just any retiree. One call, and their world flipped upside down. Here's how it all began. The morning was picture perfect. The sun stretched lazily over the quiet suburb, where lawns were trimmed to perfection, and the scent of fresh coffee hung in the air. At the center of this idyllic scene was the home of George Hudson, a 68-year-old retired veteran. His house stood proud, flanked by neatly arranged flower beds and an American flag that fluttered in the gentle breeze. George himself sat on the porch, glasses perched on his nose, reading the morning paper. His face, etched with age, carried a peaceful, almost unbothered expression. He was the kind of man who could blend into a crowd, unassuming but solid, like a well-worn rock that had seen its share of storms. Then came the sound. A low, menacing growl that quickly escalated into a deafening roar. The neighborhood's tranquility shattered as a pack of motorcycles screeched to a halt in front of George's house. Leading the pack was a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a bad action movie, tall, leather-clad, and exuding overconfidence. His name was Jake Thunder, and he clearly thought he was the king of the asphalt jungle. Jake swung off his bike with the grace of a wrecking ball, dramatically spitting onto the pavement. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like someone forgot to pay respect to the new kings of the street. That'd be us, old man." George lowered his newspaper, his calm blue eyes meeting Jake's. He said nothing, just tilted his head slightly, as if observing a curious animal at the zoo. This only seemed to agitate Jake further. "Don't you know how this works?" Jake bellowed, turning to his crew, who erupted in laughter. "We're here to teach this neighborhood some manners." One of the bikers swaggered up to George's mailbox and, with an exaggerated show of force, ripped it from the ground. Another climbed onto George's fence, snapping off a piece of wood for no reason other than to prove he could. The piece de resistance? Jake strutted over to the flagpole in George's yard and yanked down the flag, tossing it onto the ground like a piece of garbage. The neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, their faces a mixture of fear and helplessness. A young woman whispered to her husband, "Why isn't anyone doing anything?" The husband shook his head, muttering something about not getting involved. George stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, almost lazy. He adjusted his glasses, stepped off the porch, and strolled over to where Jake was still gloating over his victory. "You've made your point," George said, his tone steady and even, "but I suggest you leave now while you still have the chance." Jake froze for a second, stunned by George's composure. Then he burst into laughter, a loud, grating sound that made even his own crew wince. "What's this? A threat? From you?" He leaned closer, smirking. "What are you gonna do, Grandpa? Hit me with your walking stick." George didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his glasses again and said almost conversationally, "No, I'm not going to hit you, but I'm giving you a final chance. Walk away." Jake leaned back, feigning mock terror. "Oh no! The old man's gonna get us. Boys, you hear that? We better run for the hills." The bikers roared with laughter, their jeers echoing down the street. Jake, basking in the attention, turned back to George. "Here's the thing, Pops. We don't take orders from anyone, least of all some washed-up old—" He didn't get to finish. George's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of steel beneath the calm. The neighbors watching from their windows felt it too. It was subtle, but the atmosphere around George seemed to harden, like a storm cloud rolling in on a sunny day. Jake didn't notice. "You'll regret messing with us," he shouted, kicking George's flagpole for good measure. George remained silent, but there was the faintest trace of a smile on his lips, a smile that Jake would come to regret deeply. As the bikers laughed and continued their destruction, George turned and walked back to his porch. "Last chance," he murmured to himself, just loud enough for Jake to hear. The leader of the pack sneered, assuming he'd already won. The stage was set, but little did Jake know, the quiet George Hudson wasn't just a retired veteran. He was something far more dangerous, and this little visit would soon spiral into the kind of day Jake and his crew would never forget. The next morning, the quiet street once again echoed with the grumble of engines, but this time it wasn't just a handful of bikes. A roaring, chaotic parade of motorcycles turned onto George's street, filling the air with noise and tension. The gang had doubled in size, and their energy was unmistakably hostile. Jake Thunder led the pack, his smug grin plastered across his face like he'd already won some unspoken war. George, as usual, was on his porch, watering a hanging basket of bright red petunias. He glanced at the approaching chaos, his expression as neutral as ever, and calmly set his watering can aside. The bikers swarmed his lawn like an unruly mob. One of them, a lanky guy with a mohawk, dismounted his bike and immediately stomped into George's flower bed, crushing the blossoms under his boots. Another pulled a spray can from his jacket and began scrawling something nonsensical on George's pristine white fence. "Nice little retirement palace you've got here, old man," Jake shouted, kicking over a small ceramic gnome on the lawn. "Too bad it's ours now." George folded his arms and watched them, his silence clearly unsettling for some of the newer recruits. Jake, however, was unfazed. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue, Grandpa? Or are you just too busy planning your next crossword puzzle?" The gang erupted in laughter, fueled by their leader's mockery. One of them, a burly guy with tattoos snaking up his arms, picked up a stone and lobbed it toward George. It sailed past him, barely missing his shoulder, and clattered onto the porch. George didn't flinch. He simply turned, opened his screen door, and stepped inside. "Oh, look at that," Jake shouted. "He's running scared. Guess he doesn't have the guts to fight back." The bikers jeered, their taunts growing louder as they encircled the house. Some began pulling pickets off the wooden fence, while others stomped through the flower beds, kicking dirt and petals into the air. The graffiti artist moved on to the house itself, spraying crude designs across the once pristine siding. Jake sauntered up to the front door, rapping on it with mock politeness. "Knock knock, Grandpa. You in there calling the cops? Or maybe praying for a miracle?" Inside, George leaned against his kitchen counter, sipping a glass of water as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. He glanced at a small, unassuming black device on the counter, his fingers brushing over it briefly before setting the glass down. With a faint smile, he walked back to the door and opened it. Jake was mid-laugh when the door swung open. He stopped abruptly, blinking at George's calm demeanor. "Well, well, decided to show some backbone, huh?" George tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady and unreadable. "I'm a patient man," he said evenly, his voice carrying just enough weight to quiet the nearest bikers. "But even patience has its limits." For a moment, the air seemed to shift. The smug confidence on Jake's face wavered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. But then he laughed again, brushing it off. "Patience? Limits? What are you gonna do? Call your bingo buddies for backup?" The gang roared with laughter, their confidence restored. Jake leaned in closer, his grin as wide as ever. "Face it, old man. This is our turf now. You're just a tenant." George stepped back, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the door. His eyes lingered on Jake for a long moment before he spoke. "Tenant, huh?" he said, almost to himself. Then with a faint, knowing smile, he added, "We'll see." He closed the door quietly, leaving Jake and his crew standing on the porch. For a moment, the gang hesitated, unsure what to do with such an anticlimactic response. Then Jake shrugged, his cocky grin returning. "Looks like he's given up. Let's finish the job, boys." The bikers cheered and redoubled their efforts, ripping apart what little remained of George's garden and fence. But as they tore through the yard, the neighbors began to emerge. They didn't step in. Fear still held them back, but their phones were out, cameras recording every move. Inside, George glanced at the black device on his counter again. His fingers hovered over a small red button, but he didn't press it. Not yet. Instead, he poured himself another glass of water, his calm smile never wavering. Day 3 began with the kind of over-the-top entrance you'd expect from a bad action movie. The roar of engines thundered through the neighborhood as the biker gang returned, more determined and more obnoxious than ever. This time, they weren't content with petty vandalism. No, today was about total destruction. Their leader, Jake Thunder, led the charge, steering his bike straight onto George's front lawn, his tires ripping through the neatly trimmed grass. Behind him, the gang followed suit, revving their engines and cheering as if they'd just scored a touchdown. One of them, a particularly scrawny guy with a penchant for dramatics, grabbed a shovel from George's shed and began hacking away at the garden. Another yanked down the last remnants of the fence, tossing the pieces into the air like confetti. "Time to finish the job, boys," Jake shouted, standing triumphantly in the middle of the chaos. Inside, George sat at his dining table, sipping tea and watching the scene unfold through the window. His expression remained calm, though there was a faint glint of something dangerous in his eyes. When the first rock hit his porch, he set down his cup, stood up, and walked to the door. He didn't open it yet. Instead, he reached for a small panel on the wall and pressed a button. Outside, a loud, piercing alarm suddenly blared, cutting through the bikers' laughter. Red lights began to strobe along the perimeter of the house, illuminating the scene like a Hollywood set. The gang froze, their bravado flickering as confusion settled in. "What the?" Jake muttered, glancing around. "What's with the disco lights, old man?" His question was answered moments later when a sleek black SUV screeched to a halt in front of George's house. The door swung open, and out stepped 3 men in sharp suits, each exuding the kind of authority that made you stand up a little straighter, even if you weren't sure why. One of them, a tall man with a perfectly trimmed beard, took a step forward. His voice was calm, but carried an edge sharp enough to cut through steel. "Jake," he said, addressing the gang leader by name, "it seems you've made a grave error in judgment." Jake's cocky grin faltered. "Who the heck are you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned his attention to the house as George stepped out, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit. The transformation was jarring. Gone was the unassuming retiree in casual clothes. This George Hudson radiated authority, his posture straight and his gaze unwavering. Even his walk seemed to command respect. "I see you've ignored my warnings," George said, his voice carrying a weight that made even the boldest biker shift uncomfortably. Jake tried to recover his composure, though his bravado was visibly cracking. "Warnings? What, you think you're some kind of big shot?" George's lips curved into a faint smile, but it wasn't the friendly kind. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what was coming next. "I'm George Hudson," he said, pulling a sleek phone from his pocket. "Retired Deputy Director of the CIA." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, the gang was utterly silent, their earlier cockiness replaced by a growing sense of dread. "Deputy, what?" Jake stammered, his face pale. "You heard me," George said, his tone almost conversational. "And here's the thing about my job. It came with certain perks, like access to information." He tapped his phone screen a few times, then looked up at Jake. "For instance, I know all your names, your addresses, your little side hustles. Shall I continue?" The color drained from Jake's face entirely. One of his crew whispered, "Is he serious?" George's smile widened, just enough to make it clear he was. "You could say I'm a collector of secrets, and you, Jake, have been very sloppy." The bearded man from the SUV stepped forward again, holding up what looked suspiciously like a file. "We have evidence of vandalism, trespassing, and quite a few other things. Shall we discuss it in detail, or would you like to start cleaning up this mess you've made?" Jake's confidence shattered completely. He stumbled back, his hands raised. Wait, we didn't know. It was just a joke, man." "Ah," George said, his tone still maddeningly calm. "And now it's my turn to decide how funny I think it is." The gang, sensing their leader's panic, began backing away from the house, but George wasn't finished. "Before you go, you're going to fix every single thing you've destroyed. My fence, my garden, my flagpole, everything. And if it's not done to my satisfaction, well..." He tapped his phone again, and the alarm switched off, replaced by an eerie silence. "Let's just say you won't enjoy the consequences." The sound of screeching tires filled the air as sleek, black SUVs converged from every corner of the street. Their arrival was synchronized, like a well-rehearsed performance, and the faint hum of authority emanated from every vehicle. Doors flew open, and out stepped men and women in dark suits, their movements brisk and purposeful. The bikers froze, their bravado evaporating as quickly as the exhaust fumes in the air. Jake's once confident grin twisted into a grimace of disbelief. What is this?" he stammered, looking around as if trying to wake from a bad dream. One of his gang members grabbed his arm, his face pale. "You said this guy was just some old man. What is this, a sting operation?" Another biker, a wiry man with a bandana, pointed an accusing finger at Jake. "You set us up, man. We're gonna get busted for this." Jake spun around, his composure slipping with every passing second. "Nobody's getting busted, just shut up." But it was too late. The team of agents began fanning out, inspecting the damage to George's property and calmly taking notes. Several of them held tablets, the screens displaying live footage from the street cameras and George's own security system. Every broken fence post, every scrawled graffiti tag, every stomped flower. It was all there, recorded in high definition. Jake's crew looked ready to bolt, but George stepped forward, his calm presence commanding the scene. "Nobody's running anywhere," he said, his voice steady and authoritative. Jake tried to regain some semblance of control. "You think this scares us?" he sneered, though his shaking hands betrayed him. "You don't have anything on us." George raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of amusement and pity. "Really? You've been recorded from start to finish. Vandalism, trespassing, destruction of property. Should I go on?" Jake opened his mouth to protest, but George cut him off. "If you'd bothered to listen, you'd know I tried to warn you. I believe in the law, Jake, but I also believe in giving people a chance to make things right. Consider this your chance." The tension in the air was palpable as the bikers exchanged nervous glances. Finally, Jake muttered, "What do you want?" George crossed his arms, his tone firm but not unkind. "First, you're going to fix everything you've destroyed. My fence, my garden, my flagpole, every last piece. And when you're done, you're going to clean up every scrap of mess you've left in this neighborhood." "And if we don't?" Jake challenged, though his voice lacked the usual edge. George didn't miss a beat. "Then these fine agents will be more than happy to escort you downtown, where you'll have plenty of time to reconsider your life choices." That was enough to break Jake's resistance. "Fine," he spat, motioning to his crew. "Let's just get this over with." The gang set to work under the watchful eyes of George, the agents, and, most importantly, the neighbors, who had gathered with their phones out, recording every moment. The once mighty bikers were reduced to reluctant handymen, hammering fence posts, replanting flowers, and scrubbing away graffiti. Their movements were clumsy and slow, and every mistake earned a sharp glance from George. "You missed a spot," George called out, a hint of sarcasm in his voice as Jake tried to repaint a section of the fence. "You might want to take your time. This paint job is permanent, unlike your poor decisions." The neighbors watched with a mixture of awe and delight. One elderly woman clapped as a particularly stubborn biker struggled to replace a section of the fence. "About time someone taught these hooligans a lesson," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Hours later, the yard was restored, the mess cleaned up, and the bikers stood in a defeated huddle. George stepped forward, his suit still immaculate despite the day's events. "Now, there's one last thing," he said, his tone light but firm. "Apologies." Jake's jaw tightened, but he swallowed his pride. "We're sorry," he muttered. "I didn't catch that," George said, cupping a hand to his ear. "We're sorry," Jake repeated, louder this time. His crew followed suit, mumbling apologies to George and the gathered neighbors. George nodded, satisfied. "Good. Now get out of here. And if I ever see you on this street again..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implied threat was clear. The bikers scrambled onto their bikes, their engines roaring as they sped away. The crowd erupted into applause, and George turned to face them, his calm demeanor finally giving way to a small, satisfied smile. "Hey, George," a neighbor called out, grinning. "You got to teach us how to handle trouble like that. Seriously, you're a legend." George chuckled, tipping an imaginary hat. Just another day in the neighborhood. The laughter and cheers followed him as he walked back to his porch, finally reclaiming his peace.